They came when the night was thickest, when a village was wrapped in silence, broken only by the creak of wooden shutters and the occasional bark of a restless dog. They moved. Lanterns swayed in trembling hands, throwing wild shadows across crooked gravestones. The cemetery, once a place of solemn prayer, had become a stage for something unholy, something forbidden, something that should not have existed. And yet, for these villagers, it was not terror that brought them here. It was laughter. It was defiance. It was the wild and trembling urge to spit in the face of the one thing no man or woman could escape: death. Imagine the scene. The graves freshly disturbed, soil spilling like dark wounds. Fingers, living, calloused, stained by the earth, clawed into the ground to drag bones back into the moonlight. Skeletons, brittle and clattering, were pulled from their resting places. Skulls still caked with the dust of centuries were hoisted high like grotesque trophies. Ribs and femurs, once sacred relics of the body, became props in a midnight carnival. The villagers, peasants, mothers, laborers, men with faces carved by famine and women who had buried too many children, laughed as they spun the bones in mad circles. It was called many things by those who whispered about it. A bone dance, a dance of mockery, a danse macabre in its most literal form. But to those who took part, it was liberation, because in the Middle Ages, death was not a distant shadow. It was an intimate companion, closer than breath, always lurking at the edge of the hearth. The plague had stolen children in the night. Famine had reduced neighbors to hollow-eyed husks. War had crushed villages under armored hooves. Death was everywhere, and when a truth presses that close, when it breathes against your neck every waking hour, what else is there to do but laugh? So they laughed. They mocked. They dared to make death into a plaything, if only for a night. The clatter of bones against cobblestone echoed like drums of rebellion. The villagers stomped and shouted, their breath steaming in the chill, as skeletons were whirled like dolls. Young men draped skulls with scarves, pretending to woo them in clumsy pantomimes. Women cradled ribcages as if rocking grotesque infants. And always, laughter, wild, defiant, echoing into the night. Laughter at the very thing that had stolen so much from them. Laughter at the silence that would one day consume them all. But what would drive them to this? What ancient instinct compels human beings to drag their dead from the ground and dance with them? Is it madness? Is it sin? Or is it something deeper? A ritual born not of disrespect, but of survival? Because to stare death in the face and laugh is, perhaps, the only way to live when surrounded by its endless grip. The churchmen saw it differently. They called it blasphemy. Priests warned that disturbing the dead would invite damnation, that the souls of the departed would find no rest. Chronicles speak of sermons where fiery words condemned the villagers, painting them as dancers with demons, as puppets of Satan himself. And yet, despite the threats of hellfire, the festivals endured, because perhaps the villagers knew a truth the priests feared, that the laughter of the living carries a power greater than fear, that in mocking death, they mocked the tyranny of silence. Picture this: a boy no older than 14, clutching a jawbone in his hands. He lifts it high, rattles it like a tambourine, and the crowd erupts. His mother, who buried 2 of her children the year before, watches with hollow eyes, then begins to laugh. A sharp, almost painful laugh that spills out like release. Around her, the air quivers with firelight and madness. What began as grief has become something else entirely. An explosion of defiance, a theater of bones that mocks the great silence of the grave. And yet, listen closely beneath the laughter, and you will hear something else. A sob stifled into a chuckle, a tremor in the voice of a man holding a skull. Because beneath the parody lies grief, deep and unhealed. The skeletons are not nameless. They are fathers, brothers, wives, children. To dance with them is to confront the unbearable, to hold the truth in one's arms. Death has taken them. But for a moment, in the absurd ritual of the festival, they are brought back into the circle of the living. The laughter is not denial, it is recognition. Does this shock you? It should. Even now, centuries later, the thought is almost impossible to imagine. Graves opened, bones stripped of sanctity, villagers whirling them as partners. But in that grotesque theater lies a mirror of ourselves. We too live under the shadow of mortality. We too search for ways to laugh, to distract, to deny, or to embrace what we cannot escape. The villagers did not have philosophy books or psychologists to explain their fear. They had only their hands, their soil, and their need to endure. And so they made philosophy from bones, theology from laughter, defiance from despair. As the night wore on, torches cast long, flickering shadows across the cemetery walls. Skeletons leaned against gravestones as if resting after the dance. Some were carried through the village streets, paraded like grotesque saints. Children trailed behind, clapping, their faces lit by firelight and terror alike. The festival would end with dawn, when bones were shoved back into shallow pits, covered hastily, and the villagers slunk back to their homes. But what remained was not merely memory. It was something carved deep into their spirits. The sense that, for a few stolen hours, they had mocked eternity itself. And perhaps that is why the story still haunts us. Not because it is grotesque, not because it is forbidden, but because it reveals a truth buried deep within us all. We fear death, yet we long to defy it. We bury our dead, yet we ache to bring them close again. The villagers of medieval Europe found their answer in a dance of bones. And as the skeletons clattered and spun, they taught a lesson that echoes still. That to mock death is not to deny it, but to confront it. To laugh with bones is to remind ourselves that the grave is not the final word. It is only part of the story. This was not a carnival for entertainment alone. It was an act of survival, a ritual of power, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to bow before silence. And as you imagine those villagers, faces painted in firelight, arms locked with skeletons, their voices lifting against the cold night, ask yourself, would you have danced? Or would you have turned away, clutching your fear in silence? Because the grave comes for all. The only question is how we choose to greet it. The graveyard itself seemed to breathe with them. The grass was damp with dew, glistening beneath the torchlight, as though the earth itself wept at what was being pulled from it. Some villagers swore they heard whispers rising from the soil, voices of the dead calling not in anger, but in strange invitation, as if death itself longed to join the feast. Skeptics may dismiss it as the wind, as the creak of ancient branches, but to those present, the night was alive with presence. Every clatter of bone on stone felt like language, every echo like a forgotten hymn. The musicians, if they could be called that, were not trained minstrels, but farmers with crude flutes, blacksmiths hammering rhythms on pots, shepherd boys scraping fiddles made of gut and wood. The music was not polished. It was chaotic, raw, almost discordant, but it throbbed with energy, a pulse that made the bones rattle in uncanny harmony. And when skeletons were spun across the circle, their jaws clicking open and shut, villagers swore it sounded like they were laughing back. Imagine the terror and the ecstasy of believing, even for a moment, that the dead themselves were joining in the mockery. A chronicler from the 14th century once wrote of such a night, recording his horror in the margins of a prayer book. He claimed he saw peasants dressing skeletons in scraps of linen, painting faces on his skulls with soot and candle wax. The spectacle disturbed him so much that he accused the villagers of being in league with the devil. But hidden in his words is a detail he did not mean to give away, that he could not look away. The spectacle was irresistible, even to those who despised it. That is the power such rituals held. They lured the eye, they captivated the soul, and once seen, they could not be forgotten. But consider the paradox. To dance with bones was to court danger. In a time when graveyards were sacred, when disturbing the dead was considered a crime against God, these villagers chose mockery over obedience. Why? Because they lived in an age where obedience gave no protection. The plague did not spare the pious. Famine struck the devout as harshly as the sinner. Death cared nothing for the prayers whispered at dawn or the confessions made at dusk. And so, in the face of indifference, rebellion became its own kind of prayer. To laugh at death was to declare, even for a night, that silence could be broken. Imagine a widow standing at the edge of the crowd. Her husband, buried months ago, lies somewhere beneath her feet. Tonight, his bones may be among those lifted and spun. She does not flinch. She joins the circle, her hands trembling as she holds a skull. For a moment, she sees not the bone but the man she loved, the echo of his smile, the memory of his voice. And though her laugh begins as a sob, it grows into something louder, freer. To the outside world, it may seem grotesque, even insane. But for her, and for many like her, it is medicine. It is ritual. It is survival. The festival blurred the line between reverence and blasphemy. In one moment, skeletons were paraded like relics, carried high as if they were saints. In the next, they were mocked, made to stumble like drunks or to bow before peasants pretending to be kings. Each gesture carried layers of meaning: defiance, grief, parody, longing. It was theater, but it was also liturgy, a strange mass held not in churches, but in the graveyard itself, with the bones of the departed as both congregation and chorus. Historians now call this a survival ritual. Psychologists might name it catharsis. Philosophers might call it a confrontation with the absurd. But to the villagers, none of these words existed. They did not need categories. They only needed release. The dance gave them that release. For a night, the unbearable became bearable. The endless shadow became a partner in the dance. Some say the skeleton festivals were born out of plague years. Picture it. Entire families gone, villages emptied, mass graves dug in haste. Survivors staggered through silence heavier than stone. What words could capture such horror? None. But a dance could. A grotesque parody could. When all else was silence, laughter was the last rebellion. And so, the bones were lifted and the dead were made to dance again. Not to dishonor them, but to remember them in the only way the living could endure. But not all watched in approval. Church records from France and Germany speak of priests storming into cemeteries with torches, attempting to scatter the dancers. They railed against the villagers, warning them that demons laughed with them, that their souls would be carried to eternal fire. Some festivals ended in violence. Villagers pelting clergy with stones, choirs of laughter drowning out sermons. Yet the more they condemned, the more the rituals spread, as if resistance itself gave fuel to the fire. Perhaps that is the nature of taboo. The more it is forbidden, the more irresistible it becomes. And so the festivals persisted, carried in whispers, remembered in song, painted in hidden corners of manuscripts. The danse macabre on church walls may have been meant as a warning, but to the common people, it was also recognition. Yes, death spares no one. Yes, the grave takes kings and beggars alike. And if that is so, if the dance is universal, why not seize it ourselves? Why not mock it in our own language, in our own way, before it comes to claim us? The villagers, in their firelit circles, lived this truth more vividly than any sermon could preach. Their laughter was not mere entertainment. It was a philosophy carved into the night. It was a whisper to the cosmos itself. You cannot frighten us anymore. We have already held death in our arms, and we have danced. And yet, one must ask, was this laughter enough? Could the clattering of bones against stone drown out the sound of grief forever? Or was it a fleeting flame, a spark that vanished as quickly as the dawn returned? The villagers may not have known, but they did not care. For one night, eternity bent to their will. For one night, the dead returned not as omens, but as partners. As dawn approached, the air grew colder, and exhaustion set in. Bones were laid back into shallow graves, covered with hurried hands, as if trying to erase the night's memory before the church bells called the village to prayer. The villagers stumbled home, their faces lined with soot and sweat. their laughter fading into whispers. But something lingered, something unshakable. For even when the earth closed once more over the bones, the memory of the dance did not die. It followed them into their dreams. It whispered in their thoughts. It colored their view of the world. Perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still speak of these festivals in hushed tones. They are more than curiosities of the medieval past. They are mirrors. They show us the rawest truth of human existence, that we cannot bear to look at death without trembling, but neither can we look away. And so we invent rituals, grotesque or holy, to help us endure. For those villagers, that ritual was a skeleton's dance. For us, it may be something else, but the impulse remains unchanged. And here lies the most haunting thought. What if the dead truly did laugh? What if, for a moment, the veil thinned, and those bones rattled not only because of mortal hands, but because their owners joined in? What if the villagers were not mocking death, but sharing in its secret? A secret that life itself is fragile theater, and death is only another mask in the dance. If that is true, then the skeleton festivals were not blasphemy. They were prophecy, and the laughter of the villagers was the laughter of truth itself. Consider also the smell of such a night. The villagers inhaled the heavy dampness of the earth, the sour tang of overturned graves, the smoke of torches that stung the eyes and coated their throats. For them, this was the fragrance of rebellion, the perfume of defiance. To modern sensibilities, it might sound unbearable, but to those who had survived plague pits and charnel houses, the stench of death was no stranger. In fact, it was familiar, woven into the very fabric of daily life. And perhaps that was the point. To lift bones from the soil was not shocking. It was simply giving shape to what already haunted them. The bones themselves were fragile, brittle with age. A careless hand could shatter them into dust. Yet the villagers held them gently, even as they mocked. It was a paradox, irreverent and reverent at once. They laughed at the skulls, but they also polished them, held them like relics, set them upright as though returning them to dignity. And in that paradox lies the deepest meaning of the festival. They were not trying to erase death. They were trying to make peace with it, to give it shape, to make it less terrifying, to make it human. Listen to the rhythms of the night as if you stood among them. The stamping feet, the clattering bones, the shrill cries of joy mingled with grief. Dogs barking at the edges of the firelight, owls calling from unseen perches. Every sound formed part of the orchestra of defiance. Even the silence between bursts of laughter carried weight, like the pause in a sermon when the priest waits for his congregation to breathe. Except this congregation was not kneeling. It was dancing. Medieval writers often accused these villagers of madness. And perhaps they were right. But in madness, there is sometimes clarity. In a world where reason could not save you, where reason could not stop a plague, could not end a famine, madness offered a kind of sanctuary. The Skeleton Festival was not about losing one's mind, but about finding another kind of logic. A logic that said, if death is inescapable, then let us mock it, let us dance with it, let us make it absurd until it loses its grip. This was not madness. This was survival. What must it have felt like when the firelight struck a skull, just so, when empty sockets seemed to glow with life again? Did the villagers imagine their ancestors returned, not to frighten, but to join in the feast? Perhaps they saw their mothers and fathers, their children and neighbors, standing with them once more, not as shades of grief, but as companions of laughter. And in that moment, time itself dissolved. The living and the dead, the past and the present, all became one circle, moving to a rhythm older than words. But dawn always came, and with it, the uneasy silence. The torches guttered. The bones were lowered back into their shallow, resting places. The villagers, weary and trembling, covered them with earth once more, pressing the soil down as if to hide both their crime and their liberation. No priest could know, no bishop could hear. The festival belonged to the night alone, and yet, in secret, its echo followed them into the day. A glance shared between neighbors, a half-hidden smile, the memory of laughter lingering like the taste of smoke. Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: those villagers, in their laughter and their mockery, were closer to wisdom than they knew. For centuries, philosophers have told us to remember death, to meditate on mortality, to live with the skull ever before us. The peasants of medieval Europe needed no lecture. They had the bones in their hands. They had the laughter on their lips. They had the courage to turn silence into song, to turn despair into parody, to turn grief into dance. And in that courage, they found something most of us still seek. So when you think of this festival, do not imagine only grotesque mockery. Imagine defiance. Imagine survival. Imagine a philosophy lived not in books, but in firelight and mud, in laughter and in bone. Imagine a night where the line between life and death blurred, and for a few stolen hours, humanity won. This was segment one of their story. This was the night of unearthly revelry, and it was only the beginning. Death was not an intruder in the Middle Ages. It was a neighbor, a constant companion, a presence that walked through fields, slept in huts, and sat beside the fire when the wood cracked in silence. For us, death is often hidden, shrouded in hospital curtains, tucked away in quiet cemeteries where the grass grows neatly and graves are marked with stone. But for them, death was everywhere. It was the smoke in the air, the empty chair at the hearth, the bell tolling for yet another gone before the sun had set. The villagers who unearthed skeletons for their grotesque dances did not invent their obsession with death out of nothing. They inherited it. Their lives were steeped in rituals of mourning, reminders of the grave, images of skeletons painted on church walls. Priests thundered from pulpits, "Memento mori," remember, you must die. And so they remembered every hour of every day, because how could they forget? Death walked with them in forms too familiar to escape. The plague years had scarred their memory. Black swellings, fevers that burned flesh from within, neighbors collapsing in the street, and mass graves dug by hands too weary to weep. Entire villages were swallowed whole. A child might wake to find her parents cold beside her, while priests trudged from house to house until they too fell silent. Death had not been a metaphor, not a sermon, but a devouring storm that swept across Europe again and again. Even when the Black Death had receded, smaller waves returned, cruel echoes of the great catastrophe, as if death refused to loosen its grip. And famine. Famine was the other hand of the reaper. Fields failed, rains fell too hard or not at all, and food rotted before it could ripen. Grain that should have filled barns was eaten by rats, while children picked at roots in desperation. The dead lay on roadsides, mouths still open in hunger, bodies wasted a bone. How could laughter exist in such a world? Yet somehow, laughter did exist. Laughter sharpened like a blade against despair. The skeleton dances were not born in abundance, but in hunger. They were a reply to famine, to plague, to war. War, too, was a constant. Knights thundered across fields, their iron hooves crushing crops and homes alike. Soldiers conscripted from villages returned scarred, or did not return at all. The peasants knew war not as noble banners and gallant charges, but as smoke rising from burning roofs and cries of children dragged from hiding places. And behind war, death grinned with his hollow teeth, harvesting more souls for his endless tally. It is no wonder, then, that Europe of the Middle Ages became obsessed with death. It was not an intellectual curiosity, but a lived reality. On church walls, skeletons danced beside kings and popes, pulling them by the hand as equals. In manuscripts, death was drawn with scythes and hourglasses, a figure to haunt the margins of holy words. In sermons, death was the ever-present threat, the shadow that no wealth, no title, no virtue could keep away. And yet, within this endless presence, something strange emerged. Familiarity dulled fear. When a neighbor visits too often, even if they bring sorrow, they cease to be a stranger. Death was terrifying, yes, but it was also expected, woven into the rhythm of life. The villagers sang songs about it, told stories about it, and even joked about it. They dug their graves before they died, carving their coffins in advance, because why wait? The end was coming soon enough. This closeness bred paradox. On one hand, death was holy, shrouded in ritual, guided by priests who spoke of purgatory and paradise. On the other hand, death was mocked, painted as a fool, ridiculed in plays and carnivals. The very people who trembled before the cross also dared to laugh in the graveyard. They feared death, yes, but they also domesticated it, made it into a companion rather than a monster. That is the soil from which the skeleton festivals grew. It was not blasphemy for blasphemy's sake. It was an extension of a culture saturated with death, a culture where children saw corpses more often than they saw bread. To dance with bones was not to mock the dead. It was to acknowledge that death had always been in the room. If the priest said memento mori, the peasants answered, "Very well, we shall remember." But we will also laugh. Consider the atmosphere of a medieval village at dusk. The church bell tolls vespers, calling the faithful to prayer. Smoke curls from chimneys, carrying with it the bitter tang of burning peat. And yet, in every shadow lurks remembrance. The graveyard lies in the center, its crooked crosses visible from every street. The villagers pass it daily. They greet their dead like old friends. Life was lived under the gaze of bones. To live was to coexist with the reminder of how easily life could end. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to imagine these villagers as naive, bound by superstition. But their intimacy with death gave them a wisdom that we, who hide from it, often lack. They knew that life was fragile, that fortune could vanish with a single fever or a single bad harvest. They did not need philosophers to tell them the futility of greed or pride. They saw kings die like beggars, children die like elders, priests die like their flock. And in this brutal equality, they found both despair and strange liberation. That liberation found form in rituals. The skeleton festivals, grotesque as they seemed to us, were not isolated madness. They were part of a pattern, of carnival, of parody, of inversion. For one night, death could be mocked, kings could be ridiculed, priests could be mimicked. The world turned upside down, and in that turning, fear lost its teeth. To dance with bones was simply the most radical expression of a truth everyone already knew. Death is always near, so why not drag him into the circle and make him stumble? And so, when the villagers dug into the earth to pull skeletons from the ground, they were not breaking their worldview. They were living it. They were children of plague, survivors of famine, pawns of war, and prisoners of sermons that never let them forget their mortality. To hold a skull in their hands was simply to confirm what they already knew. To laugh at it was to claim, for one fleeting night, a power that no bishop, no knight, no plague could take from them. That is the root. That is the soil of fear and familiarity from which the skeleton festival was born. And once you understand it, the grotesque becomes inevitable. Death ruled their lives, so they danced with him. They called it a madness, but the madness spread like fire through dry fields. What began in lonely villages, where peasants dragged bones from shallow earth to laugh in the face of death, soon echoed far beyond. It did not remain confined to the mud and smoke of peasant life. The dance grew legs, and those legs carried it across Europe, across kingdoms, across languages and cultures. The dance of death, the danse macabre, was no longer only a midnight festival in forgotten graveyards. It became a vision, a painting, a sermon, a carnival of images. And everywhere it traveled, it carried the same message: death spares no one. From Germany to France, from Switzerland to England, walls began to speak with skeletons. In cloisters, in ossuaries, in the very sanctuaries of churches, murals were painted where kings and beggars held the same skeletal hands. Imagine walking into a holy place, expecting angels and saints, only to find death itself grinning from the wall, pulling cardinals and merchants into a grotesque procession. The peasants knew this truth already. They had danced with it. Now the whole of Europe would be forced to see, in Basel, Switzerland, A great mural stretched along the cemetery wall of the Dominican cloister. Dozens of figures, nobles, priests, soldiers, maidens, each led away by a skeleton. It was not art to please. It was art to wound, to remind, to terrify. Travelers came from miles away to see it, whispering as they traced the figures with their eyes. The images mirrored the festivals that had scandalized villages, except here, painted on sacred walls, the dance could not be hidden. It was there for all to see, sanctioned not by priests, but by the inevitability of death itself. And in Lübeck, Germany, another great mural appeared in the 15th century. Painted across the walls of a church, it became one of the most famous visions of death's democracy. Skeletons leapt and played instruments, while men and women of every rank and station followed them unwillingly. What had been whispered in graveyards now stood in bright pigments where anyone might look. The laughter of peasants was transmuted into color, into brushstrokes that no sermon could erase. Paris, too, had its own danse macabre. In the cloister of the Innocents, near one of the city's largest cemeteries, murals stretched across long walls. Imagine the pilgrims arriving, their feet aching from journeys, stepping into the cool shade of the cloister. And there before them, the vision of death hand in hand with all humanity. Kings in crowns, merchants with purses, monks in habits, children clinging to skeletal fingers. No one spared. The cloister became a gallery of mortality, a sermon in paint more powerful than any words from the pulpit. Why did this vision catch fire across Europe? Because the ground was fertile, because everywhere death was waiting and people could not look away. The villagers who had laughed with bones were not anomalies. They were prophets of a truth the whole continent already carried in its gut. Death's dance belonged to all, not just to the poor, not just to the desperate. It was a universal carnival, a mirror in which everyone would one day see their face. And it was not only murals. The dance entered books. Manuscripts were filled with miniature skeletons tugging at nobles and maidens. Printers in the early age of the press carved woodcuts showing death leading bishops by the crook, death prancing with fools, death whispering into the ears of queens. The dance became portable. It traveled in pages that could slip into the hands of merchants and priests alike. It was copied, adapted, translated. A contagion of images, spreading with as much inevitability as plague. In the plays of England, too, death strode onto the stage. Traveling performers wore masks of skulls, clattered bones together, and dragged men dressed as kings or friars into mock burials. Audiences gasped, then laughed, because the theater of death was both terrifying and irresistible. The festival that once shocked villagers now became entertainment for townsfolk, woven into fairs and carnivals. And always, the message was the same: you too will die. You, who laugh now, will dance when death calls your name. It was not comfort, but it was clarity, a clarity sharper than the finest sword. But there was something else in these images, something carried from the graveyard festivals into the wider world. It was not only terror, it was parody. Skeletons danced clumsily, awkwardly, sometimes even joyfully. They played fiddles, they skipped, they grinned in grotesque mockery. The message was serious, but the form was absurd. It was the same absurdity that villagers had embodied when they whirled bones under the moon. The laughter had not been lost. It had simply been painted, printed, acted, and remembered. The spread of the danse macabre reveals something profound about the medieval imagination. It was not content to keep death hidden. It needed to display it, to parade it, to carve it into stone and brush it in pigment. To us, the ubiquity seems morbid, almost unbearable. But for them, it was necessary. It was medicine. To look away from death would have been madness. To look at it directly, through art, through theater, through ritual, was the only way to remain sane. And here lies the continuity. The peasants who dug bones from the earth and danced with them at night were not anomalies. They were the root. The art of Lübeck, of Basel, of Paris was the flower. What began as secret laughter in the graveyard became public imagery on walls and stages. What began as forbidden mockery became a cultural language, shared by peasants and princes alike. The spread of the danse macabre also reveals the hunger of the human soul for equality, however grotesque. For in Death's Dance, the emperor and the beggar stood side by side, neither higher than the other. The grave was the great leveler, and the dance forced all to acknowledge it. In an age of rigid hierarchies, of crowns and mitres and chains of command, the dance cut them all down with a grin. That truth, whispered in graveyards, now thundered from walls. But was this art a comfort or a curse? Did it soothe the people, reminding them that no tyrant could escape the grave? Or did it deepen despair, forcing them to see again and again the futility of their labor, their suffering, their hope? The answer lies somewhere between. For the medieval mind, terror and consolation were not opposites. They lived together. The reminder of death was both a lash and a balm. The danse macabre became so familiar that it seeped into songs. Ballads spoke of death calling men to dance. Lullabies whispered of skeletons lurking in the dark. Children grew up with the imagery of bones as companions. What had begun as shock became custom, became part of the rhythm of life. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all, that the grotesque, repeated often enough, becomes ordinary. The skull that once made us tremble becomes the friend we cannot imagine life without. So the dance spread, carried by plague and famine, by wandering preachers and traveling artists, by presses and brushes and stages. It grew not weaker, but stronger, more embedded in the marrow of Europe's imagination. It became part of the very landscape of faith, paradoxical though it was, mockery and sermon, laughter and terror, rebellion and acceptance. And yet, beneath it all, one question lingered, unspoken but unavoidable. If all must dance, what is the meaning of the steps? If the king must fall as the peasant falls, what, then, is life worth? The villagers had answered with laughter. The murals answered with pigment. The plays answered with parody. But the question itself never left. It echoed in cloisters, in graveyards, in the hearts of all who looked upon the grinning faces of painted death. The dance had spread, yes, but spreading was not enough. The dance was only the beginning of a deeper reckoning, and the reckoning was still to come. It always began with the earth, the sacred ground, the soil blessed by priests, the field of the dead that was supposed to remain untouched until Judgment Day. Every graveyard in medieval Europe was holy ground. To step inside was to walk upon consecrated soil, guarded by prayers and incense, set apart from the filth of the streets. The dead were not simply bodies buried in dirt. They were souls waiting in patience, their bones aligned with the promise of resurrection. The graveyard was a liminal place, both sanctuary and warning. It belonged not to the living, but to the silence of the dead. And yet, under the cloak of night, villagers defied it. With shovels, with picks, sometimes with their bare hands, they broke the soil that priests had blessed. What the church had called untouchable, they touched. What was meant to remain hidden until the last trumpet, they unearthed. They became grave robbers not for gold, not for relics, but for bones, for partners in a macabre carnival, for instruments of laughter against fear. Picture the act itself, the torches casting their long, wild flames against the leaning crosses, the earth damp, heavy with moisture, men and women kneeling at mounds of dirt, digging like beasts, the sound of soil being torn open, the groan of wood as coffins splintered, the sudden glimpse of pale fragments beneath the earth. A skull rolls loose, its hollow eyes filled with shadow. A ribcage crumbles as it is pulled from the ground. The villagers, panting, sweating, lift the remains in triumph. Not relics of saints, not treasures of kings, but the raw, anonymous bones of their own kin. It is difficult for us to imagine the weight of such an act. Today, to disturb a grave is to break the deepest taboo. It provokes outrage, horror, even prosecution. And in the Middle Ages, the taboo was even greater. To interfere with the dead was to risk not only social condemnation, but eternal damnation. Priests preached that a disturbed grave would deny the soul its rest, that the body, broken from its sanctity, would be cursed. In canon law, it was sacrilege. And yet, again and again, villagers dug. Why? Because fear loses its power when it is inverted. The grave, which threatened to swallow them all, became a theater. The bones, which were meant to lie in solemn silence, became puppets of parody. The earth, which was consecrated to God, was claimed for one night by the laughter of peasants. They stole back what death had taken, if only for a few fleeting hours. There are chronicles, some written in disgust, others in fascination, that describe these acts in detail. A German cleric wrote of villagers dragging skeletons into the square, dressing them in scraps of clothing, setting them upright in chairs, and mocking them as judges or lords. In France, reports tell of young men parading with skulls on poles, marching them as if they were banners in a grotesque procession. One bishop thundered that such acts were worse than heresy, because they defiled both the body and the soul. Yet the very need to condemn them suggests how widespread they were. Imagine the atmosphere. The night is heavy with smoke and laughter. Children shriek as skulls are balanced on fence posts. Young women twirl rib cages as if they were garlands. Men chase one another with femurs, striking them like mock swords. Bones crack, dust rising like breath from centuries past. And yet, amid the mockery, there is reverence, too. A woman cradles a skull to her chest, whispering to it, rocking it as if it were the infant she lost to fever. A man gazes into the sockets of a skull, silent, before kissing its forehead and passing it into the circle. The grotesque and the sacred blur until they are indistinguishable. It is easy to imagine such scenes as chaos, but they were also structured, almost ritualistic. In some places, the bones were carried in procession, as saints would be carried on feast days. The villagers gave them voices, speaking in falsetto or growls, pretending the dead mocked the living in return. This was parody, yes, but also dialogue. It was a conversation with the grave, one in which the living dared to speak first. But the church never accepted it. Priests stormed into graveyards to halt the dances. They called them obscene, blasphemous, diabolical. Some parishioners were excommunicated, their names cursed from pulpits. Inquisitorial record from Spain and France describe villagers accused of grave desecration, their punishment swift and brutal. Yet the festivals continued. For every priest who thundered against them, a dozen villagers laughed louder. This persistence reveals something vital. These were not mere entertainments. They were rituals of power. To pull bones from the soil was to defy both death and the institution that claimed dominion over it. It was to say, you may bury us, you may preach to us, you may frighten us with visions of hell, but we will take back our dead. We will make them dance. And yet, beneath the rebellion lay grief. Every skull belonged to someone once loved, someone once alive in the same village. They were fathers, mothers, children, neighbors. To lift them was to remember them. To dance with them was to deny that they were truly gone. What seemed like mockery was at its heart longing. The villagers could not keep the dead, but they could, for one night, refuse to let them go. This paradox, mockery and mourning, blasphemy and reverence, defines the digging of bones. It is why the act shocks us even now. It is why priests called it demonic and why peasants called it necessary. For in disturbing the grave, they disturbed not only the soil but the boundary between life and death, between fear and laughter. There are echoes of this across the world. In some cultures, bones were washed and paraded as part of ancestor rituals. In others, skulls were kept in homes as guardians. But in medieval Europe, where the church demanded silence and obedience, the act of dragging bones from consecrated earth became rebellion incarnate. It was a statement that the grave belonged not to priests or to sermons, but to the people who lived beside it. And when dawn came, the bones were returned. Not with ceremony, not with prayers, but hastily, almost guiltily. The villagers shoveled earth over them, pressing the soil down with trembling hands. The crosses leaned once more, the ground smoothed as best as it could be. From a distance, the graveyard seemed unchanged. But beneath, the bones remembered, and above, the villagers carried the memory in their blood. So when we speak of skeleton dances, let's not imagine only laughter and parody. Let us imagine the moment the earth is first broken. The silence of the graveyard ruptured, the soil pulled apart like a wound. That first glimpse of bone beneath the torchlight. That first gasp, half terror, half ecstasy. That is where the festival began, not in the circle of laughter, but in the act of digging. The act of daring to touch what was meant to remain untouchable. For the villagers, this was more than entertainment. It was confrontation. It was power. It was the courage to put their hands into the grave itself and to pull from it not despair but laughter. And it is here, in this forbidden act, that we see most clearly the truth of the festival. Death was not distant. It was not hidden. It lay beneath their feet, waiting, and they chose not to fear it. They chose to dance with it. They chose to dig. The villagers laughed, but the laughter was never free. It always carried the weight of sin. For while they whirled with bones under the moonlight, while they sang and mocked and made skeletons into partners, they knew the priests were watching. They knew the sermons that would thunder the following Sunday, warning them of eternal fire. To dig bones from the sacred earth was not only scandalous, it was dangerous. The church taught that the grave was a waiting place, a holy chamber in which the body slept until resurrection. To disturb it was to disrupt God's order, to mock his promise, to endanger the soul of the departed. And yet the villagers disturbed it anyway. Here lies the paradox. To the priests, these dances were sacrilege. To the villagers, they were survival. The same act that one side condemned as heresy, the other defended as medicine. Between sin and salvation, the villagers carved their ritual. They stood not on holy ground, nor entirely on profane ground, but in a liminal space, balancing like tightrope walkers over the abyss. Priests thundered. Bishops wrote edicts. Councils condemned. In France, bishops compared bone dances to witchcraft, claiming demons whispered in the laughter of peasants. In Germany, chronicles describe clergy bursting into graveyards to scatter dancers, their torches flaring against the night. In Spain, inquisitors questioned villagers accused of disturbing the dead, accusing them of mocking the sacraments. Everywhere, the official voice of the church was the same. This is blasphemy. And yet, beneath the condemnation, there were cracks. Not every priest was eager to stamp out the festivals. Some, perhaps, understood the psychology of their flock better than the bishops did. They had buried too many children themselves. They had held the hands of the dying, whispered last rites into too many failing ears. They knew that sermons alone could not mend such wounds. And so they looked away. They pretended not to hear the laughter at night, not to see the disturbed soil in the graveyard. There are even whispers that some clergy joined. Not publicly, not in full, but at the edges, watching, half laughing, caught between their vows and their grief. They too were villagers. They too lived under death's shadow. For them, perhaps, the line between sin and salvation blurred as much as it did for their flock. The villagers themselves did not see the dances as rebellion against God. They saw them as rebellion against despair. They did not deny the teachings of resurrection. If anything, they embodied them. By lifting bones into the dance, they reminded themselves that the dead still belonged to them, that death was not final. Their laughter was not a rejection of salvation, but a desperate reaching for it. They mocked death because they longed for life. They played with bones because they longed for resurrection. But the church feared the power of such rituals. If peasants could laugh at death outside the walls of the church, what need would they have for sermons inside? If they could find meaning in laughter and parody, what need for confession and penance? The festivals threatened not only theology, but authority. And so, the priests condemned. Yet condemnation did not end them. If anything, it fueled them. To be told that laughter was a sin only made it more irresistible. To be warned that disturbing the dead would invite demons only made the festival more thrilling. The line between sin and salvation became the very stage on which the dance was performed. Every villager who lifted a skull felt the weight of damnation on one hand, and the promise of freedom on the other. Imagine the tension in their hearts. A young man whirls a skeleton in drunken parody. Yet in the morning he kneels in the church, begging forgiveness. A mother laughs until tears streak her face, then clutches her rosary at dawn, whispering prayers for the very child whose skull she rocked in her arms. A priest thunders against blasphemy, then buries another corpse that same afternoon, wondering if perhaps his flock has found a truth deeper than the one he preaches. This tension created something profound. The festival was not merely rebellion, nor merely devotion. It was both. It was sin wrapped in longing, blasphemy laced with prayer. Between sin and salvation, the villagers carved out a ritual that no theology could contain. They did not choose one side or the other. They chose both because they had no choice. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to imagine the villagers as reckless, irreverent, mocking faith itself. But to see them clearly, we must remember the world they lived in. Death pressed on them from all sides. Silence was unbearable. Grief was unhealed. If the church offered salvation after death, the villagers demanded survival before it. And so they danced, not to spit on faith, but to keep breathing in a world where breath itself felt borrowed. This is the paradox at the heart of the skeleton festivals. They were sin and salvation at once. To mock death was heresy, but it was also holiness. To laugh at the grave was rebellion, but it was also prayer. To dig bones was to risk damnation, but it was also to glimpse resurrection. And perhaps this is why the festivals endured despite condemnation. Because deep down, the villagers knew a truth the church itself half recognized, that salvation does not come only through sermons and sacraments, but through the fragile courage of laughter, even in the face of despair. The villagers stood between sin and salvation, and in that space, they danced. It is impossible to speak of the skeleton dances without speaking of the plague. For the plague was the stage on which all of Europe learned to live with death as a neighbor. When the Black Death came in the 14th century, it tore through villages and cities alike, leaving silence in its wake. No one was spared. Priests fell beside beggars, kings beside their servants. Entire families vanished in a matter of days, their houses left to crumble, their fields to rot. The chronicles describe it in stark, trembling words. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of fathers abandoning children, of mothers fleeing their infants, of doctors refusing to enter homes. The dead lay in the streets, their bodies too numerous to bury. Bells rang without end, tolling until their sound became a nightmare. In England, entire villages were emptied, their names erased from maps, their churches left to crumble beneath ivy. In Germany and France, carts piled high, with corpses rolled through the streets, the air thick with the stench of decay. No one who lived through it ever forgot. And the memory was not only of horror. It was of silence. For when the plague had taken its fill, when the graves were full and the bells had gone quiet, what remained was emptiness. Survivors staggered through streets where their neighbors had lived, past doors that would never open again. They sat in churches where pews stood half empty, where the voices of choirs were hollow echoes of what they had been. This silence was unbearable. How does one live when half the world is gone? How does one laugh when laughter itself has been buried? The skeleton festivals were born in this silence. They were an answer, not to the plague itself, but to its echo. The laughter that rose in graveyards was not innocent laughter. It was laughter sharpened by grief, laughter cracked by memory. It was the laughter of survivors who had seen too much to remain silent. Imagine a village where half the children are gone. The school is empty, the games of youth silenced. The mothers gather at the well, their arms thin, their faces hollow. They speak in whispers, for to speak too loudly is to admit the names of the lost. And yet, when night falls, when torches flare and bones are pulled from the earth, something breaks. The silence is shattered. The mothers laugh again, though the laughter is strange, jagged, almost painful. They dance with bones not because they forget the plague, but because they remember it too well. The plague returned, again and again. Smaller waves, but cruel enough. In the 15th century, in the 16th, in the 17th, outbreaks rose like storms, taking those who had been spared before. Each new wave carried with it the memory of the Great One, and each time, laughter returned to answer silence. The skeleton dances were not only festivals. They were memorials written not in stone but in parody, in grotesque carnival, in defiant joy. Priests tried to sanctify memory with masses, with candles, with solemn rites. But the peasants remembered differently. They remembered in laughter, in mockery, in the pulling of bones from consecrated earth. Their memorials were not silent. They were loud, chaotic, scandalous. And perhaps that was why they endured. Silence forgets. Laughter remembers. There are chronicles that tell of survivors unable to bury their dead properly, forced to throw them into pits. Imagine the weight of such memory. A child tossed into a trench with strangers. A father covered with quicklime instead of prayers. Such memories haunted the survivors, pressing into their dreams. And when the festivals came, when bones were lifted, it was as if those memories were given form again. The bones became the lost children, the fathers thrown into pits, the neighbors who had vanished. To laugh with them was to bring them back, if only for an hour. Psychologists today might call it trauma ritual. Survivors replaying their grief in grotesque parody, trying to master what they could not change. But for the villagers, no such words existed. They did not analyze their grief. They danced it. They mocked it. They laughed until they wept, and they wept until they laughed again. In the echo of the plague, laughter was not frivolity, it was survival. And yet, there was terror too. Many believed the dead could return, restless, angry at being disturbed. Ghost stories multiplied in the wake of the plague. Tales of corpses rising from pits, of spirits wandering roads, of skeletons walking at night. The festivals played with this fear. By lifting bones, by mocking them, the villagers tried to tame the ghosts. They tried to turn terror into parody. To laugh at the skeleton was to strip it of its power. But not everyone was convinced. Some whispered that the dances themselves summoned the dead, that the laughter of the living called forth the voices of the lost. There are tales of villagers swearing they heard whispers in the wind, voices answering their mockery. Some said the skeletons truly danced, their jaws clacking not by human hands, but by their own. Whether or not such tales were believed, they reveal something vital, that the boundary between memory and presence was fragile. For survivors of plague, the dead were never far away. This is why the skeleton dances mattered. They were not mere festivals. They were echoes of plague years, rituals of memory, parodies carved from grief. They reminded the living that survival was absurd, that laughter was a fragile shield against despair, that to dance with bones was to remember both what had been lost and what still remained. Even centuries later, the plague's echo lingered in culture. The murals of the danse macabre, the songs of death, the plays of skeletons, all carried the shadow of that catastrophe. The bone dances were not isolated curiosities. They were part of a larger chorus, a Europe haunted and yet laughing, scarred and yet mocking, grieving and yet alive. So when we picture villagers digging bones from sacred soil, we must see not only irreverence. We must see memory. We must see plague pits and empty houses, mothers clutching children who never grew old, fathers bent in silence over graves. The laughter of the bone dance was the laughter of plague survivors. And in that laughter, cracked and trembling, we hear the echoes of catastrophe. For this was their inheritance. The plague had marked them, and they could not erase it. But they could laugh at it. They could turn its silence into noise, its despair into parody, its death into dance. They could lift the bones of the lost and make them partners once more. And in doing so, they declared to the echo of the plague, "You did not destroy us. We still live. We still laugh. We still dance." The laughter of the villagers echoed against the stones of the graveyard. But beneath that laughter was a whisper older than any dance. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. It was a phrase carved into cloisters, painted in manuscripts, muttered by monks in candlelit silence. But the peasants did not need the Latin words. They lived it. They breathed it. Their dances with skeletons were not the denial of death, but its fiercest acknowledgement. In monasteries, monks kept skulls on their desks. They called them memento mori, reminders of the inevitable. Each hollow socket was a sermon, each grin a warning. All flesh must rot, all beauty must crumble, all crowns must rust. The cloister was filled with whispers of mortality. And yet, what the monks contemplated in silence, the villagers embodied in laughter. The skull on the monk's table was the same as the skull in the villagers' arms. The difference was not in the message, but in the method. The church had always used death as a mirror. Priests reminded the faithful that life was fleeting, that wealth and power would not follow into the grave. Sermons painted vivid pictures of Judgment Day, the graves opening, the bones reassembling, the souls called to account. The lesson was simple: live rightly, for death comes soon. But for peasants who had buried children, who had seen whole streets emptied by plague, who lived each day under the possibility of famine or fire, the lesson needed no reminder. They already knew. Their lives were the sermon, and so their answer was different. Where the church urged contemplation, the villagers offered parody. Where the monks whispered in silence, the peasants shouted in laughter. Both proclaimed the same truth, memento mori. Both reminded the living of death, but one did it with solemnity, the other with mockery. Consider the paradox. To laugh at a skull is to admit its power. No one laughs at what they do not fear. The villager holding a bone in the firelight was not denying death. He was staring into its empty sockets and laughing anyway. The laughter was not denial, it was courage. It was a way of saying, I see you. I know you. You do not frighten me, not tonight. This is why the festivals resonate so deeply. They were not merely carnivals of madness. They were philosophies made flesh. The peasants did not write treatises. They did not argue in universities. They did not ink words into parchment. They danced. They laughed. They turned philosophy into movement, theology into parody, mortality into theater. Their dance was their doctrine, their laughter their creed. And in this, they mirrored the greater tradition of memento mori. For what is the purpose of contemplating death, if not to learn how to live? The monks who kept skulls did so not to sink into despair, but to free themselves from attachment. The peasants who danced with bones did so not to blaspheme, but to free themselves from fear. Both paths led to the same truth, that to remember death is to be made alive. The imagery of memento mori filled the medieval world. Hourglasses dripping sand, grim reapers with scythes, skeletons carved into the margins of holy texts, coffins carried in processions where the corpse itself was displayed for all to see. Children grew up with these images, learned them as naturally as they learned prayers. Death was not hidden. It was the mirror in which all were told to look. But what did the villagers see in that mirror? Did they see despair? Or did they see a strange kind of freedom? To know that death waits is to know that nothing else holds power. The Lord who taxes you, the knight who beats you, the priest who condemns you, they too will dance. Their crowns, their swords, their sermons will fall into the same soil. And in that knowledge lies defiance. If death makes all equal, then laughter at death is the greatest rebellion. The villagers may never have spoken these words, but they lived them. Their bone dances were acts of philosophy, as profound as any written by scholars. When they whirled skeletons through the night, they proclaimed the truth the church also taught. Life is fleeting, death is certain. But they proclaimed it in their own tongue, the tongue of laughter, of parody, of firelit mockery. They took the monk's skull from the desk and spun it in the dirt. They turned contemplation into carnival. And perhaps, in doing so, they understood the truth more deeply than the scholars did. For the scholars wrote words, but the villagers lived the reality. To bury 3 children and still rise to dance. That is philosophy carved into flesh. To pull bones from the earth and make them partners. That is contemplation in its rawest form. To laugh with tears streaming, to mock while trembling. That is, memento mori, lived, not learned. The church feared this because it blurred boundaries. Philosophy was meant for cloisters, not graveyards. Theology was meant for pulpits, not festivals. But the peasants refused such lines. They made their own theology, their own philosophy, their own mirror. And in that mirror, they saw themselves more clearly than sermons allowed. So when we look back on these grotesque festivals, we must not see only blasphemy. We must see philosophy in disguise. We must see peasants who, without books or parchment, grasp the truth of mortality more vividly than most of us ever will. Their laughter was their lecture. Their dance was their doctrine. Their parody was their prayer. Memento mori. Remember you must die. The monks wrote it. The priests preached it. But the villagers danced it. And perhaps, of all these, the dance was the most honest. Authority does not tolerate laughter easily, especially when that laughter is directed at the one thing that terrifies all men equally: death. The peasants who dug bones from consecrated earth, who danced with skeletons under torchlight, were not only mocking the grave, they were mocking power itself. For what is the authority of priest or king if both must dance in the same dust? What is the strength of sermons if laughter can dissolve fear more quickly than words? And so the hammer fell. Bishops issued decrees. Councils of the church declared the festival's heresy. Preachers thundered from pulpits that those who danced with bones were cavorting with demons, calling down the wrath of God upon their villages. Inquisitors recorded testimonies of peasants accused of disturbing the dead, their laughter described as blasphemous, their festivals likened to witchcraft. Everywhere, the official response was the same: silence these dances. Erase them from the earth. Yet the dances endured. They endure because the need that birthed them was too strong to be suppressed. The people did not dance for pleasure alone. They danced to survive grief, to master fear, to seize joy in a world that offered little else. Authority could forbid, but it could not erase the wound from which the laughter sprang. And so the festivals slipped underground. They moved to the edges, into whispered traditions, into nights when priests looked away. Records from the 15th and 16th centuries speak of punishments. In France, villagers were fined for desecrating graves. In Germany, men were whipped for carrying skulls in carnival parades. In Spain, the Inquisition interrogated peasants accused of mocking death with bones. Yet each time the punishments came, the laughter returned in another form. For the people were stubborn. They cannot be forced to stop remembering, nor to stop laughing at what haunted them most. So the festivals changed. They blurred into other traditions. In some places, bones were no longer lifted, but masks were worn, skulls painted onto wood, skeletons carved into costumes. In others, the dances became allegories performed on stage, with actors dressed as death rather than death itself. The rituals were sanitized, altered, rebranded. But beneath the masks and costumes, the memory of the bone dances remained. The laughter still carried the same defiance, even if the bones no longer clattered. The church tried to co-opt the imagery. It painted the danse macabre on church walls, turning the grotesque parody of peasants into official sermons in pigment. It preached the universality of death in ways that aligned with doctrine rather than rebellion. But even this was a kind of concession. For what had begun as scandal now became sanctioned. The peasants had forced the church to adopt their imagery, to speak their language, even as it condemned the source. And in carnivals, the laughter lived on. Carnival was the season of inversion, when peasants mocked kings, when fools became bishops, when order was overturned. Death masks and skeletal costumes became part of these celebrations. Officially, they were jokes, harmless inversions tolerated for a day. Unofficially, they were echoes of the forbidden bone dances, memories disguised in festivity. Even centuries later, traces remained. In folk tales, bones rose to dance at midnight. In songs, skeletons mocked the living. In village plays, clumsy actors dressed as death stumbled through crowds, their parody as ancient as the grave itself. The festivals had been suppressed, but never fully erased. They survived in fragments, in whispers, in laughter passed from parent to child. This is the paradox of suppression. Power can silence voices, can burn books, can forbid rituals. But what is born from grief, from fear, from the deepest need of the human heart does not vanish. It changes form. It hides. It waits. And then, when least expected, it returns. The bone dances may have been driven from graveyards, but they found refuge in carnival, in song, in secret memory. Imagine a priest in the 16th century, standing in his pulpit, condemning the laughter of the villagers. He warns of demons, of damnation, of hellfire. And yet, outside, beyond the church walls, children are carving skulls into pumpkins. Men are carving wooden masks. Women are whispering old songs. The laughter waits, just beyond the reach of authority. It cannot be banished because it is born not of rebellion alone, but of need. Suppression created memory. Memory created survival. Survival created transformation. The villagers had carved something eternal into their rituals. The knowledge that to laugh at death is to steal its power. And once such knowledge exists, no decree can erase it. So the bone dances faded, yes. The torches in graveyards burned less brightly. The skeletons were returned to their earth with fewer interruptions. The laughter grew softer, hidden behind masks and plays. But it never died. It could not. For every time death returned in plague, in famine, in war, the echo of the old dances stirred again. And each time, the people remembered. Suppression may silence, but survival remembers. And the memory of bones dancing under firelight, of laughter mocking the grave, lived on, in carnival, in folklore, in the very marrow of Europe's imagination. This is where we bridge past the medieval age into the modern world. The skeleton dances may have been suppressed, but their echoes survived across centuries and continents. From the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, to European carnival skeleton masks, to Halloween skeletal laughter, the same archetype returns. The human urge to mock death, to laugh at the grave, to invite skeletons into the circle of life. I'll now create the full narration script for Segment 9, written in the same immersive, dark, poetic, reflective tone as before, with a target length of 15,000 to 18,000 characters, 20 to 25 minutes. Segment 9, Modern Echoes, Skeleton Festivals and Carnival Deaths, narration script. The torches of the medieval graveyard have long since burned out. The laughter of peasants dragging bones in a firelight has faded into the silence of history. And yet, the echoes remain. Across the world today, skeletons still dance. They smile from masks and parades. They laugh from painted skulls and carved effigies. The medieval bone dances did not vanish. They transformed, scattered into traditions that still whisper the same defiance. Death can be mocked. Perhaps the clearest echo is found not in Europe, but across the ocean in Mexico. Every year, when November begins, cities and villages bloom with color. Altars are raised, candles are lit, and skeletons return, not as terror, but as family. Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is a festival where the departed are invited back into the circle of the living. Skulls made of sugar smile from tables. Skeleton figurines play guitars and dance in couples. And families gather at graves to eat, sing, and laugh with their dead. The resemblance is unmistakable. In the medieval bone dances, peasants drag skeletons from earth to dance with them. In Mexico, families invite skeletons in spirit to sit at the table, to share bread and drink. Both transform grief into laughter. Both refuse to let death hold silence. Both blur the line between reverence and parody, between mourning and mockery. The Mexican skulls are not grotesque, but playful. Painted with flowers, bright with colors, they grin with joy rather than menace. But beneath the color lies the same truth the peasants once embodied in firelit graveyards. That to live is to live with death at the table, and that the only sane response is to embrace it, to laugh with it, to make it part of the feast. And in Europe itself, echoes linger in carnival. In the streets of Venice, masks of death once stalked processions, faces painted white, with hollow eyes and skeletal grins. In Switzerland, carnival parades still carry grotesque figures of death, skeletal effigies carried through the streets. In Germany, Fastnacht once featured costumed dancers dressed as death itself, prancing through the crowds, dragging villagers into their circle. These are not bone dances in the literal sense, but they are children of the same spirit. They are laughter carved into ritual, mockery turned into tradition. Halloween, too, though transformed by commerce and modern play, carries the same undertone. Skeletons grin from windows, skull masks leer from doorways. Children wear death on their faces and laugh as they beg for sweets. The festival has lost much of its medieval weight, its grief, its trauma. Yet the archetype remains. To laugh at death, to invite it into our streets, to mock it with costumes and games. This is the same instinct that drove peasants to dig bones from sacred earth centuries ago. Even in the arts, the echo resounds. Painters like Jose Guadalupe Posada, with his famous calaveras, skeletons in fancy hats, smoking cigars, riding bicycles, gave modern form to the same mockery. Posada skeletons are not only comic, they are social commentary. They remind us that death equalizes all, that wealth and vanity crumble into the same dust. It is the danse macabre reborn in print. The peasants' laughter, once scandalous, now hangs in galleries and museums. Music, too, carries the rhythm. In Mexico, mariachis play at gravesides during Dia de los Muertos. In Europe, composers like Saint-Saëns wrote the danse macabre, a symphonic echo of bones rattling under the bow of a violin. Skeletons dance in notes and melodies, their clatter translated into strings and percussion. What was once a scandalous midnight festival is now celebrated as high art. But beneath all these modern echoes, the same paradox endures. We still fear death, yet we still mock it. We still paint it, mask it, laugh at it, turn it into play. The villagers of the Middle Ages did not vanish into the past. They live on in every child wearing a skeleton costume, in every family who sets a skull-shaped sweet on an altar, in every parade where death marches as a guest. The laughter they carved into the night survived centuries of suppression. It lives in us. And yet, something has changed. For the peasants, the laughter was born of grief, of plague, of hunger. It was survival in the face of despair. For us, the laughter often comes from distance, from comfort, from spectacle. We laugh at skeletons on candy wrappers, not at the memory of plague pits. And so the echo is fainter, safer, more commercial. But the archetype remains. Even when dulled, it speaks. Even when painted with bright colors or turned into children's play, it whispers the same truth. Death is near. Death is certain, and laughter is the only rebellion. This is why the echo matters. It shows us that the instinct to mock death is not medieval alone, nor European alone. It is human. It is universal. Across continents and centuries, the same ritual returns in new masks. Skeletons dance in Mexico, in Europe, in America, in art, in song, in play. They will always return because the need that summons them never dies. And so we must ask, what does it mean that we still laugh with skeletons? What does it mean that we still paint their faces, march them through our streets, set them at our tables? It means that we, like the peasants before us, cannot bear silence. It means that grief demands laughter as its counterweight. It means that death, no matter how terrifying, can be made a companion. The bone dances were suppressed. The graveyards grew quiet. But the laughter never vanished. It transformed, scattered, took new shapes. And today, when skeletons grin from altars or parade floats, when masks of death leer through carnival streets, we are still hearing the same echo. The villagers laugh with us still. The torches are gone now. The graveyards are quiet. The villagers who once danced with bones have long since returned to the soil themselves. Their laughter dissolved into the silence they once defied. And yet, across centuries, their voices reach us still. In painted murals, in carnival masks, In echoes of music and ritual, their rebellion lingers. They remind us that to live under the shadow of death is to live as all humans must. But to laugh under that shadow is to live as few dare. We began in a graveyard, with peasants clawing bones from consecrated earth, their laughter trembling between grief and blasphemy. We followed them through plague years, through sermons and condemnations, through murals painted on cloister walls, through echoes carried into carnival and into modern festivals of death. We have seen their laughter suppressed, yet never silenced. And now, as we stand at the end of this journey, we must ask, what does it mean? What truth did these villagers, in their scandalous dances, uncover? It is tempting to dismiss them as mad, to call their rituals grotesque, their laughter reckless, their mockery sinful. But look deeper. Look past the surface of bones clattering in firelight. Look past the scandal of disturbed graves. What you see is something far greater. What you see is the most human of all truths, that to embrace death is to embrace life. The villagers were not philosophers, not theologians, not artists. They had no parchment, no ink, no cloisters in which to meditate. Their philosophy was written in mud and firelight, their theology carved into laughter, their art born of grief. And yet, in their crude parody, they reached a truth more profound than any scholar's tome. They understood that death could not be denied, could not be hidden, could not be erased. It could only be faced, and the way they faced it was with laughter. What courage it must have taken to lift the skull of a child lost to plague and to laugh instead of collapse, to spin the bones of a neighbor and to mock the silence instead of sinking into it, to dance with the very thing that haunted them. That is not madness. That is strength. That is the human spirit refusing to bow. The church preached memento mori. Remember, you must die. The murals painted skeletons tugging at kings and popes alike. But the peasants went further. They remembered, yes, but they also mocked. They did not only contemplate death. They wrestled with it, spun it, kissed it, ridiculed it, embraced it. They lived memento mori not in silence, but in laughter. And perhaps that is the truest form of remembrance. What then do their festivals teach us? That life is short, that grief is heavy, that fear is suffocating, but also that laughter, even cracked and trembling, is stronger than silence. That to mock death is not to deny it, but to rob it of its sting. That to dance with bones is to remind ourselves that we are still alive, still breathing, still able to defy. The echoes prove this truth. From Mexico's Day of the Dead to Europe's carnival masks, from Halloween skeleton costumes to symphonies of rattling bones, the same archetype returns. We cannot escape it because we cannot escape death itself. The instinct to mock the grave is woven into us, as ancient as the first burial, as eternal as the first tear. We laugh with skeletons because we must, because if we do not, silence consumes us. And so, the villager's lesson becomes ours. Death will come. It will strip us of wealth, of power, of beauty, of breath. It will come for kings and peasants alike, for children and elders, for priests and heretics. It is the only certainty, but how we greet it remains our choice. We can tremble, we can hide, or we can laugh. We can take its hand, pull into the circle, and make it stumble with us in the dance. This is not blasphemy. It is not denial. It is the highest acceptance. To mock death is to admit its presence, to stare into its sockets and still sing. To embrace death is to embrace life, because only when we acknowledge the end do we truly value the moments that remain. The peasants knew this, though they had no words for it. Their laughter was their wisdom. Their dance was their philosophy. And perhaps this is why their story still moves us. We live in a world that hides death, that fears even to speak its name. We push it into hospitals behind curtains, into cemeteries far from our homes. We surround ourselves with distractions, with illusions of permanence. But the villagers remind us that death must be faced, not hidden. That fear can be broken, not by denial, but by laughter. So let us imagine them one last time. The torches flickering, The earth broken, the bones lifted, the laughter rising, cracked with grief but burning with defiance. Skeletons spinning in the firelight, their jaws clicking as if in rhythm with the song of the living. Villagers stomping the earth, their voices echoing into the night, mocking the silence that waits for them all. They're gone now. Their bones lie quiet, but their laughter has not vanished. It echoes in our festivals, in our art, in our music, in the deepest chambers of our fear. It whispers to us across centuries, do not tremble, do not hide, dance, laugh, mock the grave, for in mocking death, you embrace life. And that is the final truth of the festival. Beneath the scandal, beneath the grotesque, beneath the blasphemy, lies a wisdom as old as humanity. The villagers knew it, though they never named it. We must learn it again. To mock death is to embrace life. To dance with bones is to remember that we still breathe. And as long as laughter rises in the shadow of the grave, death has not won.